Bowing to mounting public pressure, Egypt's caretaker prime minister steps down. But is that enough to appease protesters? What's next for Egypt's revolution? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Essam Sharaf. Egypt took another step to ridding itself of the old Mubarak regime with the resignation of the country's prime minister. Ahmed Shafiq was appointed by former President Hosni Mubarak just days into the momentous protest that led to his own fall from power. But Egypt's pro-democracy campaigners had demanded Shafiq follow him out the door. He's been replaced by Essam Sharaf, a former transport minister and a man who took part in the protests himself. But hundreds of demonstrators continue to gather in Tahrir Square to keep up the pressure for change. They include removing the 30-year-old emergency law that allows people to be arrested and held without charge. They want the dissolution of the State Security Investigation Bureau and the immediate release of all political prisoners. Those all remain high on the agenda for protesters. So what other issues lie ahead? Well, let's take a quick look. As we've just mentioned, the people want the removal of anyone who was pro-Mubarak or appointed by him. But could there be a power vacuum in their place? Egypt's ruling generals have provisionally decided to hold a constitutional referendum on March 19th. Parliamentary elections are set for June and a presidential poll in August. But youth activists criticise the tight timetable, saying it would favour remnants of the National Democratic Party. And finally, although the Military Council has received an amended version of the Constitution, they have yet to publicly approve it, leaving the people unsure of what lies ahead. Well, joining us now to talk more about this from Cairo, Hossam El-Hamalawi, activist who was closely worked with labour unions and work strikers in Egypt. Hossam, many thanks for being with us. I want to start with the announcement of the resignation of the Prime Minister Ahmed Shafiq. What do you make of that? Is that a promising start?
Well, I'm definitely happy for this move, and I am sure that many of our comrades and colleagues are also jubilant about what happened today. And this also happens as other cheerful news is coming out. The Cairo University administration has announced that it's also lifting the notorious police security forces they had on campus, and they will replace it with a civilian security force. And we have some of the prominent political activists, like some of the leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood, who've been sentenced in military tribunals on bogus charges. They will also be released. But I have to say this is not enough. What's more important is the significance of that move other than the move itself. This means that we have pressured the military junta into making another concession, but the pressure should not stop.
And what do you think of his replacement, Essam Sharaf? Is he up to the job?
I don't know Mr. Essam Sharaf personally, but from what we hear about him is that he looks as definitely someone who's much more respectable than the other regime figures that have been presented to us before. But here is my concern. The current civilian government in the making and the current reforms are happening while the military generals who are part of Mubarak's regime are supervising the process. So that's why we're always concerned what sort of regime will come out after this process. So we have to be vigilant and we have to continue with our protests and our strikes, especially that there are some alarming signs. Today, the military police suspended by force a strike by the gas and oil workers in Nasr City who were protesting in front of the oil ministry, and they arrested 20 and they injured 3. This is happening as also other protesters like our friend Amr Abdullah al-Bahiri have been sentenced on bogus charges in a military tribunal a couple of days ago to 5 years in prison. So as you can see, there are conflicting signs that we are receiving, so we have to continue to be vigilant.
What let's talk a bit more specifics about the civilian government that you mentioned earlier. What other posts do you want to see people replaced?
Well, definitely all the posts. Not a single post would be an exception. This is a revolution. A revolution is about, at the end of the day, establishing a new regime. A new regime means new institutions and new structures. We have a saying here in Egypt, ما ينفعش تعمل من الفسيخ شربات. You cannot make a sweet drink out of rotten fish. And the Mubarak's dictatorship has been a rotten fish. So all officials coming from that dictatorship will be rotten fish, as well as the institutions. It's not just about individuals. For example, how can you reform State Security Police and our Interior Ministry? This is an institution that has been solely devoted not to the protection of the public security of the Egyptian citizens, but of the political security of the state. Now, to think that if we get a new general to lead that institution, speaking of which, there was a very worrying report today in Al-Ahram mentioning that General Nabil Al-Izabi is recommended for that post. We cannot confirm that, but General Nabil Al-Izabi is the butcher of Kifaya, as we call him. He's the guy who oversaw the crackdown on the Cairo Spring in 2006, and he's the guy who orchestrated the sexual assaults against women reporters and activists on the 25th of May 2005 in what became to be known as Black Wednesday. So that's why, although it's definitely an optimistic sign that Shafiq was impeached or he resigned, and that we have a much more respectable figure now, but we have to continue to be vigilant.
And how do you propose to continue to push those in power to enact the reforms that you're talking about? Is it continued protests out in the streets?
Okay, well, the mainstream media and the government has tended to deal with the Egyptian revolution as a Tahrir revolution solely, meaning that everything more or less in the public media and in policy making has been solely devoted more or less to what's going on in Tahrir and the mood in Tahrir and the protests in Tahrir. But I want to draw your attention to another phenomena which is taking place and hasn't received its share of media coverage, which is the labor strikes. And that's the only weapon we have now. It was the mass strikes 2 days before Mubarak resigned or Mubarak stepped down. These are the mass strikes that brought down Hosni Mubarak. And with the stepping down of Hosni Mubarak on the 11th of February, on a Friday, these strikes basically did not stop. While the middle class activists were too happy to call on everybody to go back to work and to build a new Egypt and let's give it 110% and be loyal and be faithful, you know, and they were singing all of these patriotic lullabies. Now, I'm afraid that the working class cannot afford doing the same. Because a middle class, let's say a middle class person who works in a job, probably he's getting something like that's more than 1,000 Egyptian pound and can go up to 7,000 Egyptian pounds. But if you look at the public transport workers here in Cairo who've been staging continuous strikes and demonstrations, you can meet a worker or a driver who's been in service for 20 years and he still receives 189 Egyptian pounds. I cannot ask this worker to go back and to resume his work under these conditions. And these workers are not going to wait for another 6 months when the military junta would be kind enough to allow us a civilian government in order to get his economic rights. So if you ask me about what's the next step is throwing ourselves 120% in this current strike wave, unionizing workers, bringing together strike leaders in a national network, meaning establishing a new trade union federation, and last but not least, establishing a workers' party that will represent the political interests of the working class and the majority of the urban poor in Egypt in the current revolution.
Well, let me put forward to you the view that I know many Egyptians have, is that while they sympathize and they share a lot of the views that you've just talked about, the concerns of average workers and their pay and the lack of employment and so on. And they basically tell us, we're with you on all of these things. There are important issues that need to be addressed. But right now, the biggest problems are getting the country back on its feet, namely law and order. Crime has been rampant since these protests began, since the police largely disappeared from the streets. That is something they say needs to be addressed right away. Also, economic stability. You talked about raising people's wages, raising people's standard of living. The country is basically in a crippled economic state. The stock market hasn't been functioning for almost a month now. And they're basically saying we need to get this country back on its feet and get the tourism industry running again before we can address any of these other problems. What do you say to that?
I strongly disagree. Getting back, first I have to mention something, which is the issue of law and order. We did not have law and order under the Mubarak's dictatorship to start with. I mean, the house beside my place has been attacked twice by thugs, for example, last year, and the police never showed up despite our continuous calls. And whenever they showed up usually 3 hours, if not a day late. Thuggery and crime has been in Egypt before the revolution. And the reports about the skyrocketing rates now of crimes and rapes are happening everywhere and this and that, they have been exaggerated largely by the regime and its cronies and by the Interior Ministry in order to convince the public that the police force should be back on the streets in its current form. But the point is, I mean, I live in a neighborhood which is a middle-class neighborhood. I have other friends who are living in working-class neighborhoods. And security has been run by the popular committees and citizen watchdogs. And actually, we didn't face much problems. Now, regarding getting the country back on its feet, I mean, this is a very confusing term. What do you mean getting our country back on its feet? I mean, the country was not standing on its feet to start with. Secondly, those workers and what they are doing.
What I mean is that the
revolution.
Tourists have left. Foreign investment is drying up. People aren't able to take money out of the banks. We're talking about everyday economic activity that is essential to the functioning of the country.
Exactly. Well, people could not take money out of the banks. Largely, it's because the government had shut down the banks. It's not because the protesters went and sabotaged the banks, for example. During the first week of the uprising, when businesses were shut down, this was also, a government decision. It wasn't the protesters who went and destroyed and looted, all of these public facilities, for example. Thirdly, sir, and that's very important, who sets the priorities of the revolution? Who sets the priorities and say this is the priority number one and this is priority number two? It's definitely not me, and it's not the youth who are going now in order to establish channels of communications with the military junta, because this revolution does not have a leadership at the end of the day. And what the people do in the streets is what dictates our agenda. And it happens that millions of Egyptian workers, without any sort of agitation, they have already on their own have started striking. And these are not just economic strikes. If we are talking about overthrowing the regime, in every single company, in every single factory, in every single workplace, there is a mini Mubarak. Mubarak's minions are everywhere. And the unified demand all across those strikes is fighting corruption, impeaching and prosecuting corrupt managers. Third, or last but not least, if you want to talk about getting this country back on its feet, I think Mubarak's fortune on its own, which is estimated from 40 billion to 70 billion according to reports, can spare us USAID for another 50 years. If you read Al-Ahram, and I was shocked to find out that there was a report about the fact that the current cronies being investigated by the public prosecutor, their fortunes amount to more than $250 billion Egyptian pounds. The money is there. And if the military junta was really very keen about getting this country back to its feet, just go and nationalize, this money and get us our money back. It can be solved in a matter of a couple of days. But don't go and blame those strikers who are fighting for their rights, because they've waited so long for that.
All right, at this point, I want to bring in our other guest. Joining us from Doha is Shadi Hamid, Director of Research at the Doha Brookings Center. Sir, thanks very much for joining us. Your take on what you've been hearing so far from Hossam al-Hamalawi and the pace of reform in Egypt. Do you think far more needs to be done?
Well, there's definitely a sense of frustration now. I think there was a misinterpretation of the military's role in the beginning. People saw the military as the savior of the people, but of course the military was part of the regime and was close to Mubarak for a very long time. So I think it was a little bit unrealistic to think that the military would become a pro-democracy organization overnight. It's not a pro-democracy organization. So we're starting to see some real frustrations coming from the protesters about the pace of reform. They want to see more. Perhaps the resignation of Ahmed Shafiq is a positive step in the right direction, but I think from their standpoint, they want to see a lot more being done, from the lifting of the emergency law to trying certain Mubarak cronies, as Hussam was talking about. Billions of dollars have been embezzled out of the country, and that can help get the country back on track. So there are a list of demands, and we'll have to wait and see. It's still fairly early. It's been less than a month since the revolution.
Right. As far as the timetable of reform, it does seem to some people that the military has perhaps been in too much of a hurry to hand things off to a civilian government, and some say that there's a danger in that a lot of these reforms, there won't be time to enact a lot of these reforms before they hand this off to someone else, and so whatever reforms are made are likely to be very superficial. Do you think there's a danger of that?
Well, I mean, there's a big debate about how much time is needed to do certain things.
Some people would say it needs a year at least.
Well, I'm not sure about that. I mean, that is certainly one of the things that's been brought up, that 6 months is not enough to kind of undertake the reforms in preparation for the upcoming presidential and parliamentary elections. I think it's really about political will. Is there will on the part of the military to move quickly and to make serious changes on the ground? You don't need 3 months to decide you're going to hold certain Mubarak cronies to account and put them on trial. You don't need 3 months to decide that you want to overturn the emergency law. I mean, some of this is relatively straightforward. Where it becomes very difficult is in how do you design the electoral system? Are we talking about a proportional representation system? Are we talking about a winner-takes-all system similar to the US? So there has to be a debate about what will the political structure look like? What are the necessary constitutional reforms? That's where I think there is a legitimate argument to be made that 6 months is not enough. On the other hand, do you really want to have a one-year transition where the military is in power and starts to get used to being in power? That's also a risk, I think.
Well, the argument that's made against that as far as the military is that so far they haven't shown an interest in staying in power, and again, as I say, that they want to hand this off to some type of civilian government. They certainly want a lot of admiration and respect with the Egyptian people for not turning their guns on their own people, and for eventually forcing Mubarak out. They certainly want to keep that reputation intact, don't they?
Well, yes, they do, but we're starting to already see some tensions between the military and the opposition. I mean, they used force against protesters last Friday using similar tactics that the Mubarak regime used, whether it's tear gas and so on. So, I mean, sooner or later, there's going to be more clashes between the military and the opposition. That's inevitable. Again, the people who are in charge are not known to be democracy activists. These are not people who love freedom. For 30 years or longer, they supported a very authoritarian regime. So I think we have to keep that in mind. And the military controls a large sector of the Egyptian economy. It has a whole range of privileges, and it has a status quo that it wants to protect. It doesn't want to see the whole system overturned. Everyone has their interests in the end.
Hossam al-Hamalawi in Cairo, if I could turn back to you on this. One of the perceived strengths of this democracy movement before it toppled Mubarak from power was the fact that it was very broad-based and it wasn't unified around a single leader or a single figure, if you will. In the post-Mubarak era, could this now be seen perhaps as a weakness and at a time when leadership is needed now more than ever?
Well, it has its own pros and cons. On the one hand, spontaneity is always something needed. It unleashes the creativity of the people, and you always hit the regime from where it never expects to be hit. But at the same time, as you proceed and you go along, a leadership must evolve. Maybe thank God that we didn't have leadership for the uprising, because the overwhelming majority of the current political parties and groups had already failed us before the uprising, and they were playing Mubarak's game. They knew the red ceiling. So I think it was a positive thing that we didn't have leadership for this uprising. But if you want to talk about a leadership that can negotiate, or a leadership that can provide a vision for the people, I don't think we should be really in a hurry. Everything evolves. The police disappeared from our streets. The popular committees evolved in order to compensate for this power vacuum. When the services collapsed in one area, the people stepped in with their own initiatives. So the leadership that we are aspiring now for is a leadership that, as our colleague Shadi here was saying, does actually look with concern and skepticism to Mubarak's generals who are running the show now, because these generals are the ones who provided the backbone for this dictatorship over the past 30 years. And it's the military junta which receives $1.3 billion from the US every year, so we can expect closer relationship between the two. So the leadership that we have must be a leadership from below. I'm not really obsessed with the names that the media keeps on circulating, like al-Baradei and others, because I believe that we're 82 million Egyptians or more, and you can find actually alternative leaderships if you push for these struggles from below.
And what do you make of the pace of reform, as we were talking about earlier? You think it's too much too quickly, or do we need to take our time here?
For me, it's not really a question of timing. It can take as long as it wants or as short as it should be, but it's who's in charge while this process is happening. When you get the military generals running this process and administrating it, then you have to be very skeptical and vigilant, because the military, at the end of the day, can engineer a civilian government. I mean, I do believe that they don't want to stay in power forever, and that they would prefer handing over the political power to a civilian government. But do we want to end up with a system like Turkey, where you have a civilian government, for example, but the military institution is so powerful that it's very difficult to cross the line with? It's about who's running the show. And as long as Mubarak's generals are over there and they are the ones administering this transformation, then I would be very skeptical. And for me, it's not really about, like, is it going to take 1 week or 6 months? It's about who's administering it.
Shadi Hamid, if I could turn back to you on this. Whatever government emerges out of this transitionary period, do you feel it's one that the Egyptian military, as powerful as it is in the country and as powerful as it has been for so long now, has to be one that they will ultimately be happy with?
Well, I don't think it's so much an issue of what they're happy with. I mean, there will be elections, and the cabinet should be formed according to the results of those elections. We're assuming that the military is not going to intervene in the electoral process and try to rig the ballot. So it's really up to the Egyptian people who they want to vote for. Now, if the results aren't to the military's liking, but let's keep in mind that everyone who's participating now has the military's approval. So the one big fear would be the Muslim Brotherhood, but the military has already shown that it's okay with the Brotherhood playing a larger role in politics. There has been a dialogue between the two sides. So I don't really see an emerging party or group that would really threaten the military or get them nervous in that respect.
Well, you mentioned the Muslim Brotherhood there. They're a very well organized group, and they've done well in a previous election. Does it concern you perhaps that there are other opposition groups that are still trying to get themselves established, that need more time to do that? Otherwise, a group like the Muslim Brotherhood, as some people fear, will have more power in all of this?
Yeah, that's a real concern here. Will other political parties have a chance to develop and form and build their constituencies? Right now, we just really have the Brotherhood, the old ruling party, and a few smaller liberal parties that don't really have much sway with the Egyptian people, like Al-Wafd or Al-Ghad. So that is a big concern, and I don't really know if it's a question of 6 months and 12 months. What I think has to happen is that these parties have to be encouraged to form. They have to have full freedom to reach out to Egyptians, to have access to the media, and that has to start right away. And it's not starting yet, and that's where I think there's some concern about how much the military is willing to facilitate a political environment that's conducive to the building of political parties.
All right, we are out of time, gentlemen. We want to thank both of you for taking part in the discussion. Shadi Hamid and Hussam El Hamalawi, many thanks for your time. And thank you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. As always, you can take part in the debate yourself. We welcome your comments and suggestions. You can email them to us anytime at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Bye for now.